Unsiloed podcast is produced by University FM, elevating the stories of your institution.
Welcome to Unsiloed. This is Greg LeBlanc, and I'm here today with George Selgin, who is a retired professor, I guess professor emeritus in economics from the University of Georgia. And also, I guess you just stepped down from your position at the Cato Institute, where you were the director for the Center on Monetary and Financial Alternatives. And you've also written a bunch of books on monetary history, mostly, including this most recent book called False Dawn. I guess I shouldn't say monetary history. It's actually about a lot more than that, of course. The New Deal and the Promise of Recovery. Also, you wrote a book called Floored, which was about the Great Recession, book called Money Free and Unfree, book called Less Than Zero, and another one called The Menace of Fiscal QE, or Quantitative Easing. Welcome, George.
Thank you, Greg. It's nice to be on your program.
Well, let's talk about the False Dawn book. I'm an economic historian, and although I spent most of my time studying Europe, I did teach American economic and financial history for a while. And of course, the big event there is the Great Depression, right? I mean, it's sort of anybody who studies American history has to spend some time on this. And I think your book highlights a couple of the myths surrounding the way we understand the Great Depression. And two of them are that, number one, the New Deal is what kind of helped us get out of the Great Depression. And number two, that the New Deal was fundamentally Keynesian, right? And so therefore,
Yes.
right, it's a great case study in how Keynesianism has helped us to become better policymakers in the 20th and 21st century. And so maybe we can try to tackle both of those. I love how you talk about how Keynes was not a big fan of the New Deal. He didn't see this as a Keynesian intervention, did he?
No, that's right. He tried his best to make it so, and he did write several times to Roosevelt, and he had one meeting with him, presumably in that meeting as well, but certainly in those letters that he wrote, most of which were published publicly as well. He encouraged more Roosevelt to undertake more fiscal stimulus. It's true that we think of Roosevelt as having been a big fiscal stimulus guy because his administration ran record deficits. And they were big. They were big by the standards of the day, and they were somewhat bigger than some of Hoover's, but in fact, they were not big deficits by standards, today's standards. That is, they don't measure up to what we would consider as fiscal stimulus deficits with a big oomph. And in fact, most of those deficits were run despite the fact that Roosevelt was a fiscal conservative, very much so, certainly up to 1938, and I think afterwards as well. As a result, he was willing to run deficits when it was necessary to do so to fund his relief programs, which were a very important contribution in themselves. But otherwise, he resisted deficits. He tried to balance the budget on numerous occasions, and that included vetoing expenditures that weren't related to relief, the big exception, and otherwise arguing for economy and budgeting, and finally raising a lot of taxes in an attempt to avoid deficits as much as possible. So Keynes was pushing him to do more, but Roosevelt was not inclined to do more than he did. And by the way, the biggest deficit in the 30s under Roosevelt, and the only one that truly rivals the deficits in the last years of Hoover's administration. And Hoover had a very similar attitude towards deficits. He tried to avoid them too, but couldn't. The biggest one was 36. And that was part of the 36 budget. And that was a result of the bonus army bill that paid the World War I soldiers their bonuses ahead of time, which
which
was
he vetoed.
yes, it was passed over his veto. He vetoed it. So you have this one deficit that really did carry a fairly substantial fiscal stimulus oomph, so to speak, because the money was put out right away. There was no delay, and it was a lot of money. But it was not a part of the New Deal. If what we understand by the New Deal is that set of policies that the Roosevelt administration was in favor of undertaking.
Well, you mentioned these three R's, right? Recovery, relief, and reform. And it seems that a lot of people were, like, including Keynes, were saying, focus on the recovery, right? Get the
Yes,
recovery
right.
out of the way, and then you can start tackling these other things. But it seems
Indeed.
like it was the relief and the reform that wound up taking precedence.
That's right. Keynes really had two critiques of the New Deal. One of them was that some New Deal programs he considered absolutely harmful. Examples were the NRA, the National Recovery Administration, with its price setting and micromanagement of individual firms and industries, which he thought completely wrong-headed for the same reason that most economists since and many at the time thought it so. Another example was the gold purchase program that preceded actual formal devaluation of the dollar in January 34. So Keynes had these criticisms of New Deal policies uh, that he considered harmful. But he also believed that Roosevelt had his priorities wrong. Not so much putting relief ahead of recovery, because I think Keynes had relatively few complaints about the relief efforts, many of which, of course, involved substantial deficit spending. So, as far as Keynes was concerned, that was itself helpful, even if Roosevelt didn't think that deficits per se were doing any good. But he believed that reform policies, and this was particularly true in the second Roosevelt administration, but somewhat in the first, that the New Deal's reform efforts were ill-timed, even if their long-run benefits were substantial, even if Keynes wouldn't have criticized them at other times, he felt that this was not the right time in the middle of a depression for those reforms to be pursued, in part and in large part, according to Keynes, because many of them had a chilling effect on investment, which needed to recover, had completely collapsed. Uh, by scaring businessmen and by contributing, generally speaking, to uncertainty about their future earnings. So he was very critical of that. And the whole animal spirits discussion in the general theory uh, was partly uh, a reaction to that kind of intervention during a depression. He said, "You've got to coddle these businessmen. You've got to make them feel loved. You can't be telling him that you're going to throttle them in the interest of long-run reform of industry and society. Not now."
Yeah, well, look, while some policies may not have helped a lot, there were definitely some policies that harmed things, right? That actually made the depression worse. I mean, were
That's
these
right.
rooted in an misunderstanding of how prices work? I mean, obviously, we can we can support something like inflationary policies to get the economy moving again. But if the prices are lifted by constricting supply, I mean, this seems to be
Yes.
antithetical to the goal, right? Which is to boost production.
Yes, absolutely. Well, it's one of the paradoxes, or one of the things that's puzzling about the New Dealers and Roosevelt in particular, and it's something that's often misunderstood, is that he wanted to get prices up. He made over and over. He stated that one of the goals of the New Deal in its recovery efforts was getting prices back up, particularly farm prices, And there were good reasons for wanting to emphasize farm prices, but
Right, because
prices
all
in
of your
general.
because the debts were fixed,
That's right.
and they couldn't service their debts, and so there
That's
was
right.
lots of failures and bankruptcies, right?
So they believed in that, but they didn't want inflation. Now, today's listeners are going to say, what? But let's be careful. In those days, the word inflation meant expanding the money supply. And so what they wanted was to raise prices without monetary expansion. And that's possible, of course. You can do that. But as you said, that means that instead of getting prices back up by reviving demand through either fiscal policy or monetary policy, that is, fiscal stimulus or monetary stimulus, the Roosevelt administration toyed with supply, restricting supply, or otherwise controlling prices, sometimes by actually mandating increases in prices and wage rates. So the two main pillars of the New Deal recovery program were the National Recovery Administration and the AAA, and both of them sought to increase prices through one or other of these supply side approaches. The NRA, of course, notoriously uh, cartelized industries. They actually suspended the antitrust laws while the NRA was in effect and allowed industries to get together and form their own codes. When they took too long to do so, the government passed its own set of temporary codes, which then the industries could replace with their own as they got them organized. But all of these codes were designed to raise prices to basically they were letting the industry set cartel prices, or if they wouldn't, the industries didn't do it right away, the government did. And this had very profound adverse effects because, as people know today, or should know, one wonders after the New York election, uh, imposing price controls to keep prices down leads to shortages. It can lead to shortages of goods and services because there's less stimulus to produce. And at this time, though, the price controls were meant to boost prices. Well, when you do that, you get surpluses. And it's important to stress that you get surpluses of not just goods, but labor. You have unsold goods and labor that is underemployed. The only reason why unemployment didn't go down a lot more than it did while the codes were in effect was because of something called labor sharing that also was part of the New Deal efforts. I'm not sure whether this one, I think it really belongs in relief rather than recovery. But basically, they took every job, every full-time job, and made more than one part-time job out of it. And it was only by studies have shown that it was only by virtue of that that you didn't get even worse unemployment after the NRA codes went into effect, as
So
long
the
as
total
they
amount of
lasted.
labor didn't. So the total amount of labor didn't go up.
No,
They just
no,
sort of
it
spread it
actually went
around.
down. That's right. The actual number of labor hours employed went down, which is just what you would think would happen as a result of real wages going up. They went up after the codes went into effect a lot. They went up a lot, which with people standing in line trying to get jobs, because at least at the very beginning of this, it had high double-digit unemployment. Be very perverse for real wages to go up, but that was a result of the codes. So theory would say, well, we're going to have unemployment get even higher, back into the double digits as it was in March, back into the 25% as it was in March 33. And it didn't, only because of job sharing, only because of job sharing. So if you take that into account, the deleterious effects of the NRA were really quite severe, very severe. Everybody got quickly very sick of it, including the businessmen who at first thought they might benefit from forming cartels. Of course, it's a fallacy of composition. Each businessman said, great, we get to have cartel pricing in our industry. That is, that they were the bigger businessmen who controlled the process, but they were getting screwed by every other cartel that was being created contemporaneously. So the NRA was a big disaster. I talk in my book about certain recent revisionist studies that try to claim that it actually was beneficial, and do my best to show why those studies aren't compelling. Basically, they say, well, this created positive price inflation expectations, but of course, people aren't stupid. They may have expected prices, and they did expect prices to go up as a result of the codes, but they also understood that these codes were going to be harmful to real output. And so if you take the both expected changes into effect, you don't necessarily get an economy that's more buoyant. You could get the opposite, and I think you did. And all optimism about the benefits of the NRA was gone within a year. Everybody was like, no, this isn't working, including most of the administrators. The one holdout, the person who held out longest, wanting to try by hook or by crook to keep the NRA going, was Roosevelt himself. But who wanted to even revive it after the Supreme Court declared it unconstitutional in May 35. I was going to say something a little bit about agriculture. There, of course, equally notorious was the fact that the agricultural administration, adjustment administration, they went about trying to raise farm prices. How? Not by contributing to demand, because this is neither monetary nor fiscal stimulus, but by reducing crop acreage and killing off livestock. And that, of course, those things would raise prices, but not in the way you want to raise prices to stimulate output. In fact, of course, it's directly reducing output. And it reduced demand for farm labor. And the people who suffered dramatically from this, particularly, were the sharecroppers and farm laborers and tenant farmers, and particularly in the Cotton South, many of whom found themselves completely out of luck. They were supposed to share, but for the most part did not share in the payments that were being made to the landowners for withdrawing crops from production. And many ended up having, to head elsewhere looking for work or to join the ranks of people on relief programs, mostly in the cities.
So where did the ideas for these policies come from? Because I don't. My familiarity with the history of economic thought, I've rummaged through there trying to figure out like who would have inspired this, and
Yeah.
I can't figure out who might have. I mean, I can see why certain large enterprises might be enthusiastic about cartel formation. I could see why organized labor might be in favor of increasing wages for
Yes.
for
Yes.
union employees, and I could see perhaps why certain large landowners might support, policies which increase the value of their land. But I don't understand who are the economists who were supporting these policies.
Well, there were, unfortunately, a fair number of those, and the ideas behind both the AAA and the NRA had been floating around for a decade before, even more. Uh, and sometimes the inspiration was somewhat ironic. The crash of 1920-21, although it was itself rapidly resolved, mostly through deflation, uh, inspired much of the thinking that went behind the NRA in particular. Partly a very naive theory was involved. It went like something like this, and I don't oversimplify very much. I could point you to sources that say much the same thing with a straight face. I'm saying it somewhat facetiously, but the theory was, well, when we know that prices fall when we have a depression. And if they wouldn't fall, we won't have a depression. So anything that keeps them from falling will help get us out of a depression. That was the simple theory. With regard to labor, it had a more, I won't say more sophisticated, but there was a more complete argument that was still completely wrong. And that was, if we raise wages of workers, that will give them more purchasing power, and they will spend more, and therefore industry can be will have greater demand for its goods. In other words, they saw this as a way of doing stimulating aggregate demand. The word wages is doing a lot of heavy lifting here because it has two meanings, and this is where the fallacy comes in. Yes, if you can somehow raise workers' wages in the sense of their total wage earnings, that means they'll have more to spend and blah, blah, blah. But how do you do that? Well, you don't do it just by mandating higher wage rates, which is what they actually, that's how they actually try to do it, because the firms don't have the revenues to pay the same amount of labor higher rates. So what that does is simply means that fewer labor hours get employed. And unless there's work sharing, fewer laborers get employed full time. And so you end up with less employment and the same, perhaps less being actually spent, but you're not raising aggregate spending by raising wage rates. So there was a very elementary fallacy, but it was definitely part of the reasoning that had been in play. Part of this was inspired by Henry Ford. You know, he had the workers earning exceptionally high wage rates, and the argument was, see, this is allowing all the workers to buy Model Ts or something, and so Ford is actually benefiting by paying these higher wage rates. Well, no, it didn't work that way. It didn't work for other industries either. But it was a common misperception that higher wage rates meant higher wage earnings and therefore greater aggregate spending. So that
Well,
was part of it.
there's also the National Labor Relations Act, right, and the Wagner Act, which led to, yeah.
Yeah, that came after, and it was to some extent informed by the similar arguments about the high wage. I call this a high wage fallacy. Others have too. Uh, but there were other reasons that worked behind that legislation. So it had its special interest motivations and all that. It also had its legitimate motivations because labor got really ripped off by the NRA. The NRA was supposed to help labor as much as it helped industry with its wage and price codes, but labor ended up getting short shrift. And so the Wagner Act, which is the more popular term for the act you're referring to, was partly motivated by the desire to redress the balance. So there were many things involved. Agriculture had been in trouble throughout the 1920s, and different theories of how to revive it had been floating around all along. The one that finally got implemented with the AAA was just one of those theories that dusted off. What's significant, at least from a historian's point of view, is that it is also was the plan that that the Democratic platform Roosevelt ran on in 1932 had expressly rejected. So, so it was not what people were expecting from his administration. I don't think the other plan was any better, by the way. Agriculture was going to be in trouble because of the overplanting during World War I. And what you saw was a lot of farms simply couldn't survive, not because of a lack of general demand, though obviously that made things worse, but because of a relative lack of demand for agricultural products starting in the 20s. And that's why bank failures also were severe already in the 20s. The 30s just made things worse when various factors caused the collapse of overall spending to contribute to the relative crisis of agriculture.
Well, they also tried to help the farmers with the farm loans, right? And I think these subsidized loans, they mainly benefited the large landowners, right? rather than
Yeah.
the sharecroppers or the farmers.
Yes, pretty much all the farm programs tended to help the farm owners, but not necessarily their workers. And when you're pulling land out of production and reducing livestock production, the people at the low end are far from being helped, of tending to be badly hurt. Now, if the payments being made for reducing output had been shared with the former tenants and wage workers and sharecroppers, then it might have been a different story. But particularly in the South, the big landowners didn't thought to it that they got all the money, and everyone else got nothing. And like I said, so many of them had no jobs at all because they weren't needed, and they were truly destitute as a result of these programs. It was one of many respects, I'm afraid, in which the Roosevelt administration's record, particularly on the rights of African Americans, was actually rather poor, at least with regard to his, particularly with regard to his economic policies. And there was a lot of debate and discussion among the New Dealers about this. Some of them were very upset and wanted the administration to do something about how the cotton the cotton kings in particular were screwing their sharecroppers and tenant farmers, etc., mostly African American, but not entirely. But the votes of the South were very important to Roosevelt, and so they had a very hard decision that they ultimately made in favor of not insisting that the Southern cotton plantation owners share the proceeds of the program of the
Well, I think for
you
most
know
historians of the Great Depression, they point to monetary and banking phenomenon as being at the
yes,
heart of it, including Ben Bernanke, right?
yes.
And the banking system seemed to be particularly fragile. I mean, I remember when I was in school, we talked about how 11,000 banks were too many for the U.S., but they had
Yes.
what, 17,000 banks
Oh,
back
but
then
if you
when the
go back
economy
to
was even smaller.
yes, if you go back to the 30s, you get up to the 30,000 and more. If you go
Wow.
back to the 20s, I mean, I'm sorry,
Yeah.
when the failures really start happening during the 20s after the World War One boom, agricultural boom. And so we have to remember that the reason there were so many banks was not natural. It was a result of restrictions on branch banking, which were widespread. Not every state prevented branching, but many did. And in branching across state lines was very difficult under these circumstances. Of course, it was relatively almost unknown. And so you had lots of very under-diversified one-town banks. They might be dependent, many were dependent on the success of a particular crop, let alone on the success of the agricultural sector, which was in bad trouble in general after World War One. So they started failing left and right when the relative price of agricultural output fell as Europe began to produce crops again, etc., and the American output was simply couldn't be marketed locally at prices that yielded a profit. So the farmers couldn't pay their mortgages. They had gone heavily in debt to build up their production and acreage and buy tractors and that sort of thing. And now they were not able to pay. So that was the beginning. What happens in the 30s is this is compounded by the collapse of the gold standard, which is collapsing because it was basically itself turned into a house of cards after World War or during World War One, when gold payments were suspended, and afterwards, to get back to the old gold standards, it would have required a lot of deflation. Some of that took place. Some devaluation took place, which was another alternative. But what also took place was attempts to run the gold standard on the cheap, so to speak. The so-called gold exchange standard was an arrangement where you tried to make the old gold standard, or to try to make the existing gold stock more capable of supporting a much larger money stock internationally than the old gold standard could possibly have done, the pre-war one. But that required cooperation among different central banks. Particularly, it required that central banks of many countries treat their deposits at the Bank of England or at the Fed as being equivalent to gold. If they cashed their chips in, the whole thing would come tumbling down. And France, just as it did with Bretton Woods, France proved the spoiler. It started to ask for its gold back. Britain went off the gold standard in 31. That generated panic all around. And so all of this is contributing to still a greater, now generalized decline in demand, decline in money stocks, decline in demand, and that's what makes the Great Depression truly great, particularly in the United States.
Well, look, I mean, most of us have this view that the banking crisis was driven by people's lack of faith in the solvency of
Yes,
the
yes.
banks. But you point out that it was really more to do with a lack of faith in um, the maintenance of the dollar's value, right? There was really
Well,
more of
it was both up until the 30s. It was bank runs were not that important to cause of bank failures. The banks were simply not. They had too many non-performing loans, so you didn't really need to talk about bank runs, let alone panic-based runs, to explain bank failures up until the 30s. And it's really only it's there are starting in the 30s, you start to have these clusters of bank failures where there's some element of contagion, but it's very limited. It's very limited. It's limited to banks that are groups of banks that are bound up with each other, and some of which are pre-run insolvent. So the Diamond Dybvig type panic story is still not very relevant. It's mostly fundamentals that are causing most bank failures. Though now they're not just in agriculture, asset prices are falling in general. The Bank of United States failure, which was the biggest one and the most notorious, that was due to its real estate, its involvement in real estate lending in New York. It broke every rule of sound banking. It didn't fail because of panic. It ultimately was able to pay back its creditors, depositors, in full, but it took many, many years, which is a sign that it was definitely and not just a question of panic that brought it down. And there were no serious runs resulting from a contagion from the Bank of the United States. Only one other important New York bank failed, and it wasn't because of it failed because of a rumor that started by some communists, had nothing to do with the Bank of the United States. Anyway, contagion isn't that big a factor. What does become a separate factor is fear. Two things. Two things start to make people panic. One is the gold standard, in mounting fears that the gold will be devalued. Particularly, they start after the Bank of England goes off gold, and then some other banks are going off gold. So people are getting the idea that, well, it might happen here. And once FDR is elected, those fears become more and more serious. It's hard to say whether it's to his credit or not that he refused to take a very firm stand on whether he was going to devalue or not. He didn't want to lie about it. On the other hand, you can't say you're going to devalue unless you're going to do it right away. Because
Well,
if you
didn't Hoover kind of also stoke those fears?
Yes, Hoover made a speech where he talked about how the U.S. had been within an inch of devaluing after Britain devalued, and that was really stupid too. So all of these things are fueling fears of devaluation. Now, here's the thing: if you think the dollar's going to be devalued at this time, remember it's a claim so far to a fixed number of ounces of gold. You're going to get your gold if you can, rather than wait, because if they devalue before you get your gold, you're going to have dollars that are worth less. So people start running on their banks, staging runs on gold. And it was actually even though, regardless of whether they thought the banks themselves were solvent, right? This is not about insolvency. You run your bank if you think there's going to be devaluation, even if you think your bank's perfectly sound. The big victim of these runs was the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, because that's where the gold is. So people are cashing in their deposits for Federal Reserve notes, but then they're running on the Fed itself, and particularly the New York Fed. And it's the New York Fed. People don't know this. It's the New York Fed that's first calling for New York Governor Lehman to declare a bank holiday. They wanted the other New York banks, the big commercial banks, the Wall Street banks, to also join in this call for a New York State bank holiday, for starters. And the New York banks didn't want to do it. They said, "Oh, we're okay. We can weather this." And I think they could. But ultimately, they went along. And when the New York Fed, when New York declared a holiday, it in turn sparked panic in other states. It meant that many banks couldn't access their New York correspondent accounts, so they're in trouble because of that. And so holidays themselves tend to spread. They are a bank. There's a bank holiday contagion that is not a pure panic contagion. And finally, so many states had declared holidays that it was only a matter of time before they all had to. But that didn't quite happen because before it could, Roosevelt took office and did what Hoover had toyed with doing but wouldn't do for various reasons, and that is declare a national bank holiday. And that shuts down the banks. But by the way, I think shutting down all the banks served a purpose. If it hadn't happened, uh, the situation would only have gotten worse. Uh, the, the bank holiday and other steps the Roosevelt administration took immediately upon taking office to stop the rot in the banking system, at least to the extent of preventing any more money from being withdrawn, was the first step towards a recovery, a necessary step, as was by this time ultimate devaluation of the dollar. It had to be. It was too late to. By that time, there wasn't any question that they could restore the old dollar, in my opinion. But it's important to realize that the whole plan for the bank holiday and the steps taken to reopen the banks gradually uh, came from the Hoover administration. The Hoover Treasury team, much of it, stayed on board, stayed there when Roosevelt took office, and they were the ones who had the whole plan. One of them even drafted the first version of FDR's famous first fireside chat, explaining what the holiday's all about and how the bank's going to be reopened. So the Hoover administration needs to get some credit for that part of what the Roosevelt administration actually did. And so that's one reason why it's not clear that this is all on the plus side of the New Deal balance sheet, but it's cheating a little bit because it's really only partly FDR's doing. Of course, his part was very good. He'd get that speech was wonderful, and it's also was not part of the New Deal in the sense that all of these things had to be. Uh, they were very ad hoc steps taken without any preparation. The Roosevelt administration had not made any of this part of its pre-inauguration planning.
Yeah, I mean, it highlights two things. One is that I think the traditional account has Hoover more or less doing nothing, right? Whereas in
Yes.
fact,
Yeah.
the administration did quite a bit, and laid quite a few foundations for what later became the New Deal. And the second thing is that, Roosevelt didn't really have a plan. And to the extent that he had a plan, the platform of the Democratic Party looked nothing like, right,
Oh no, it was
what he
not.
wound
That's
up
right.
doing.
The Roosevelt made two statements, one of which was turned out to be a very accurate description of what his administration would end up doing, and the other one of which would be a very inaccurate statement. This is all in the course of the campaign. The accurate statement was when he said that his administration planned to go about addressing the Depression through bold experimentation. And that is absolutely true. There was a lot of trial and error. And the problem is, as I say in my book, the problem with bold experiments is they often fail, and this has to be remembered. And the reason I emphasize that part of Roosevelt's plan is because it's hard otherwise to understand why there should be many programs that just didn't work. Well, that's the nature of bold experimentation, right? A lot of them aren't going to work. The other thing, though, the other thing he said, the other concrete thing he said was upon being nominated, he declared that he was going to implement the Democratic platform, which had, of course, not been written by him, but by other participants in the Democratic Party. And he didn't. And if you go through that platform, most of the things it says, or many of the things it says, he didn't do at all. There were some exceptions, but there are many things that were quite contrary to what he would end up doing, like the agricultural plan that was implemented being something that the platform renounced. It also said that he was committed to sound money, which for most people meant, we're going to stick to the gold standard. Of course,
And
didn't
balanced
do that.
budget too, right?
Yes, he not in that speech, but in others, he assailed Hoover for his deficits. Not insincerely, by the way. Like I said, he really was a fiscal conservative. So he intended going into office to do better, but circumstances made that impossible.
So the banking reform that was put in place, right, like the separation of investment and commercial banking, and the rollout of
Yeah.
the deposit insurance. I mean, a lot of people think that those were the key interventions that
Yes.
saved our banking system, but
Yes.
I think you're a bit skeptical about those.
I'm very skeptical. Deposit insurance was part of it, of course. But deposit insurance meant that small depositors no longer had any reason to run. But its part in allowing banks to be reopened without them failing immediately again because of runs was very small, very relatively small compared to other things that I think were greater factors. Another contribution that the importance of which was exaggerated was the claim that the public was convinced that by Roosevelt that uh, the banks were all going to be inspected during the course of this relatively short holiday, and the inspectors were only going to open the solvent ones, and that way the public didn't need to worry about whether the open banks were really going to survive or not. The problem is, of course, that there weren't enough inspectors they couldn't possibly do that. And I don't think that the public remember that the bank runs tend to get started by sophisticated depositors, then the other ones join in, and certainly the sophisticated depositors, and these are also the ones who aren't insured, they're not going to believe that the inspectors have been able to determine for all these thousands. There's still many thousands of banks that the ones that are opening are all insolvent. So what's the real story? Well, there were two things that were, I think, especially crucial. The first, which is easy to overlook, is that by the time of the bank holiday, many of the banks that were closed by that holiday that had survived up to that point were perfectly sound. Remember, it's a run on gold is going on, and that's bad news for some of them. But it's not it's not that the public thinks that all these banks are insolvent. So, uh, and the inspectors. The reason why they were able to work relatively quickly wasn't they didn't bother to go through most of these banks' books. They knew they were sound. They just looked at the last reports before the holiday and said, "Okay, that's fine." So they knew that a lot of these banks were banks that people trusted. And like those New York banks that didn't want to have a holiday at all. So plenty of banks were reopened quickly because there was no doubt about their soundness, and nobody was going to run on those banks with or without insurance, with or without the inspectors. But the other thing that was crucial, of course, was that you couldn't have the gold, you couldn't make gold available. So the other thing they did was to suspend the right of people to withdraw gold. And then they threatened to publish the names of the people who had already gotten their hands on gold in order to induce them to bring as much gold back as possible. So once people no longer could withdraw gold from the banks, there was no longer that incentive to stage runs on the banks. I think that these were the main reasons why many of the banks could be safely reopened, and people would have confidence in them even if they weren't insured or didn't have their deposits fully insured. And insurance was temporary until January 34. The true FDIC insurance only kicked in then.
So what did they get wrong with monetary policy? Because one would think
Oh,
that devaluation, which should lead to inflation, should lead to expansion. What went wrong there?
well, again, this is all part of the New Dealers' desire to raise prices, but not to encourage monetary expansion. Okay, I know it's a hard pill to swallow, but it is descriptive of the reality of that regime. So you're right. In principle, devaluation of the dollar should have meant that there were more reserves in the system and more nominal uh, gold reserves, and other things equal, that should have meant more expansion. But they didn't do it that way. The government actually, the Treasury, grabbed the gold from the Federal Reserve. It gave the Fed banks gold certificates at the old gold dollar value, and then they devalued the gold, which meant that the Federal Reserve banks didn't get any increase in their reserves or gold certificates. Instead, the Treasury got the full capital gain, as it were, and they used that to establish the Exchange Stabilization Fund and for some other purposes. So the Treasury got it. Now, once the Treasury starts dispersing, right, if it spends that money, that's going to help. But that's fiscal stimulus, right? But as far as monetary stimulus was concerned, devaluation didn't itself contribute to it at all. That is, contribute to the Fed's ability to engage in it. But the more serious problem with monetary policy is that, particularly after 1935, when Mariner Eccles becomes the Fed chair, is that, but even before, is that nobody at the Fed believes in monetary stimulus. They don't think it's going to help. So they think it's going to be pushing on a string or whatever. And Eccles doesn't believe in it. Eccles is a keen believer in fiscal stimulus. He's an early a pre-Keynesian Keynesian in that he got his beliefs independently of Keynes. Uh, which is great, except he was at the Fed. He had no role in fiscal policy. So, as far as monetary policy was concerned, he was not a big believer in stimulus. So, if you look at the Fed's assets during the whole of the New Deal until World War II, until American entry, it's their interest-earning assets are flat. There absolutely no buying of securities to speak of, no increase in discounting, and those are the two ways the Fed would expand its interest-earning assets, by buying commercial bills or buying Treasury securities, and nothing happens. More happened under Hoover. Hoover, they had one big experimental round of open market purchases under Hoover, and Hoover was a big supporter of that effort. He was the main person who made it happen because there was a lot of resistance at the Fed then. So Hoover Hoover gets actually pretty high grades for believing in monetary stimulus and trying to make it happen. But the Roosevelt administration didn't do anything with it. Now, that doesn't mean there was no monetary stimulus. And now I'm going to puzzle your hearers again, thinking, what's the matter with this guy? But what I mean is that the Fed's balance sheet did grow and bank reserves did grow after 33, but they grew because gold was coming into the country.
And this is all
And
because of Hitler, right? Hitler was
it's
the guy who's driving,
it's
and they were
mainly,
driving them.
yes,
Yeah.
the main reason for the gold inflow, at first, it's the devaluation itself, which does temporarily trigger a change in the balance of trade. But because the Fed didn't take advantage of that to expand, it has a very limited, short-lived effect. And then, of course, other countries are also devaluing, and the terms of trade will tend eventually to get back to where they were. But what keeps gold flowing in for the rest of the decade, and more of it as time goes on, is Hitler's rise to power and the gathering war clouds that eventually have many Europeans thinking, I don't think this place is safe for our gold, and as long as they could, taking it and shipping it to the United States, where now, after the suspension of the gold standard and the devaluation, the Treasury alone is buying all the gold. You want to bring gold to the United States, you sell it to the Treasury, you get your gold receipts, and then the Treasury deposits usually a like value of gold certificates at the Federal Reserve. So the Fed's balance sheet does grow from this gold flow. It's not gaining gold itself. That goes into Fort Knox or otherwise is held by the Treasury, but it is gaining gold certificates nominally equal to the gold the Treasury purchases. And that's the only source of monetary expansion. And even that, and we'll get on to this later, but at some point, the Treasury decides, the administration decides that this monetary expansion, which is not deliberate, as far as the U.S. policies are concerned, is a bad thing. Because as I said, they don't like monetary expansion. They like higher prices without it. And they eventually decide to do something about it, and that has terrible consequences. We could talk more about that. But so monetary policy, bad. Fiscal policy, not very good. And the thing that people have to remember when they are inclined to think, oh, we need to look back at the New Deal and all the wonderful things they did to end the Depression. They knew so much, they had all these experiments. No, we know a lot more about how to fight recessions and depressions than they did, because we know that fiscal and monetary stimulus are our best hopes. And those were two things that the Roosevelt administration did not put much, if any, emphasis upon. And that, of course, just hearing that should give a lot of people second thoughts about how helpful the New Deal was. They did a lot of stuff, but they didn't do the main thing we rely on now. The main things. They didn't promote monetary stimulus, and they didn't promote fiscal stimulus, except somewhat, reluctantly.
So, in other words, the recovery happened not because of, but in spite of New Deal policies. But we're left with
For the most part, yeah. I don't.
Yeah.
Let me just, Greg, if you don't mind, let me say that there were some useful and helpful New Deal policies. Closing the banks was helpful. Devaluing the gold standard was helpful, but it could have been a lot more helpful than it was. And by the way, it contributed to worldwide recovery, because when the higher the price of gold got, the more it stimulated gold production worldwide. And this was particularly important because the other thing that was fueling all that gold inflow into the United States was the fact that the Siberian mines are now churning out a lot. So we shouldn't just thank Hitler. We need to give Stalin a little credit, because he was promoting the production of gold in Siberia, big time, with some subsidies as well, substantial subsidies. But anyway, they did other things. You mentioned the farm credit programs. I thought that there were two programs for basically restructuring mortgages, refinancing mortgages, where the government played a central role. And this was an essential role because, for various reasons not worth going into, it was unlikely that these mortgages could be refinanced entirely by the private sector. There was a program for farm mortgages, and there was another one for home mortgages. And these were big programs, and they helped both the mortgage holders and the borrowers. They were very helpful. I think they were a couple. Well, we know the homeowners loan corporation, the residential one. We know that it ended up doing a lot of good, and it didn't end up costing that much money. Partly because although even the government ended up having to foreclose often enough because the borrowers couldn't even meet the better terms that the government mortgages involved. It was able to dispose of the property ultimately at a decent prices because of World War II. World War II came to the rescue in many ways. But the program, I think, was beneficial. It was clever, and what it did was to allow debt contracts. It allowed them to be adjusted because they're among the most inflexible of the nominal contracts out there. And they are the main reason why you couldn't just rely on deflation to get the economy back on its feet. But insofar as nominal debt contracts were part of the reason for that, these government programs helped to overcome it. And so, to some extent, ease the pain that otherwise could only be eased by getting aggregate demand back up.
Well, it seems like there's a silver lining in these policies, which is total factor productivity seemed to go up during these years. And is that because the companies had to figure out a way to make better use of the labor supply that was more expensive and constrained?
Uh, Not that much. Most of the gains in productivity that took place in the 30s, and of course, they were very substantial. Alexander
Oh yeah,
Field
Alex
wrote.
Fields. Yeah. Uh-huh.
Alex wrote wonderful books. I've drawn on a couple of them at least.
Uh-huh.
And he wrote about the great productivity leaps of the 1930s, but a lot of it was based on technological breakthroughs before the Depression that, took a little time to yield their fruits. But we have to remember that the silver lining to the Depression cloud, this silver lining has a bit of a cloud inside of it. Because when productivity grows, what that means is that the frontier of the economy is expanding outward. That is, the potential output is growing. But the problem with depression isn't fixed by having potential output increase, though that's a good thing. The problem with depression is if the economy isn't at its potential output. And so if the potential output increases, that itself doesn't mean that the economy is recovering, because it's still far away from what is now a further out production possibility frontier. So the only way you can have recovery is not by having gains in total factor productivity, although you want those gains. You certainly don't want to not have them. They do make people better off, but you still got to get everybody working. You still got to be fully employing your available resources to truly take advantage of the technological breakthroughs that have occurred. So you can't lift an economy out of a depression that's involving a lot of unemployment and underemployment of your factors by inventing new things. You're just creating more opportunities that you're not able to fully exploit.
Yeah. And you also talk about how delaying some bankruptcies, particularly in the railroad sector, kind of slowed down their investments and their adaptation.
Yes. This was one of the things the RFC did, was they tried to save the railroads from going bankrupt, the railroads were at first the only important recipients of RFC funding other than banks themselves. But they were recipients because a lot of banks and financial institutions were holding railroad bonds. And so indirectly, this was meant to help the financial institutions recover. But it kept the banks from going bankrupt, and studies have shown, I think, fairly convincingly that in fact the railroads would have been better off ultimately if they had been allowed to simply go bankrupt and restructure. There would have been more maintenance and more employment of workers for the maintenance of stock and track and equipment and all that. So this was one of many RFC programs that was counterproductive. Another, though, that was not, I think, was the RFC purchases of bank stock. Well, now, the stock purchase program, I think you could argue, was helpful for allowing many of the banks to reopen, because they couldn't reopen without it. They were undercapitalized and wouldn't have qualified for the deposit insurance. And I think that that was part of the package of changes that contributed to stabilizing the banking system, and so helped set the stage for recovery. The biggest problem with the New Deal is they didn't then take advantage of what had been a good start. You've got to stop the collapse first, and make sure it doesn't continue revive. But then you've got to go beyond that and get demand back up again. And there, the New Deal's efforts and alternatives mostly proved counterproductive.
Well, look, I mean, I think you've highlighted that there are a lot of misconceptions, but I mean, do you think that the misconceptions, in the end of the day, are sort of, a good, noble lie, right? Because it sort of helped, I don't know, legitimize Keynesian monetary policy, even though it was built on a fictional history. Because, I mean, we've certainly figured out ways to manage these things better. I mean, after the collapse, after World War II ended, I mean, we didn't go back into a depression. I mean, the global financial crisis, we seem to figure out a way out of that. I mean, would is that myth necessary to kind of
I don't
help?
think so. We do have a lot of myths about Keynesian fiscal policy. There actually hasn't been much Keynesian fiscal policy ever. Brad DeLong is very good on this. If you look at we do, of course, now we do have more deficit spending, deliberate deficit spending to deal with recessions, and that's Keynesian enough. But if you look at the overall patterns of government spending, countercyclical policy is relatively small beer. But no, I don't think we really needed the Great Depression to get people to think that fiscal stimulus was a good thing. And one of the reasons why is that there were many advocates of fiscal stimulus before Keynes. He repackaged it, he gave it a kind of scientific gloss that it didn't have before, not all of which I think was particularly helpful. But there were all kinds of people recommending to Roosevelt that the need for countercyclical government spending. And by the way, Hoover had been a big booster of the idea of countercyclical public works, the biggest in government before the Great Depression. But once he was in office, he found himself, as Republicans tended to find themselves, under a great deal of pressure to not go too far, although he went further than anyone had up till that time with deficits, just as was the case with FDR. So there were plenty of advocates of countercyclical fiscal policy. It's Keynes gets the credit not so much because he was unique, but because he came up with more than just an argument for countercyclical government spending. He came up with a whole apparatus that gave a big boost. It wasn't so much the boost he gave to countercyclical policy, or the new versions, the new ideas he came up with, it was the boost he gave to the professionalization of macroeconomics by creating a whole, a whole new way for people to talk about it and to make them experts of themselves about it with this somewhat arcane language that he used. I don't like the general theory. In my book, I praise Keynes quite a bit for his advice, but I don't like the general theory very much at all. I think it's a great marketing exercise, but his portrayal of what other economists were thinking prior to that book's appearance was completely unfair. They weren't the naive believers in the Say's law that he makes them out to be. And I think a lot of the apparatus of the theory is not that helpful. The way I finally understood the general theory as a grad student was to realize that, uh, first of all, that the term general theory is rather misleading. It's a theory that makes it's a set of theoretical ideas that specifically assume that the one scarce thing in the economy is the means of exchange, money. And then if you believe that, a lot of the stuff, all the rest comes right through. But that isn't generally true. It's true sometimes, and at other times it's not, like when we have inflation. So I don't really like that book. We've gone off the subject, but I do defend Keynes insofar as his specific advice about the New Deal and the U.S. Depression was concerned. I give him, an A for that. I think I say outright in the book, but I certainly believe that if Keynes's advice had been followed instead of what the New Dealers did, that the Depression would have ended much sooner than it did in the United States. I believe that absolutely.
Well, George, thanks so much for joining me. This is a fantastic history. Added to the collection. It's up there with Friedman and Schwartz, I think, on the bookshelf.
I'll take that. Thank you.
Yeah. It's called False Dawn, The New Deal and the Promise of Recovery. Thanks so much for joining me.
Thank you, Greg.
Unsiloed podcast is produced by University FM, elevating the stories of your institution.